Hello, good evening. I'm John Haywood. I'm a medieval historian and I specialise in the history of Northern Europe and in particular the Viking Age. I've written 3 books on Viking history, and I'm fairly new to Viking cruises. I've spoken on 3 cruises so far, and I hope to be back at sea, all being well, speaking on cruises in Norway next spring and the medieval trade routes of the Middle Ages, Bergen to Barcelona, a little bit later next spring. Now, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So if any questions occur whilst I'm speaking, send them in and hopefully you'll have a chance to answer them when I finish with the talk. Now, I'm going to start by talking about Viking Age Iceland. Just in case anybody is at all unsure, the period that we're talking about AD 800 to 1100. The title map here, for anyone who's interested, is the earliest map of Iceland, and it was produced by a Swedish bishop called Olaus Magnus in 1554. So can we have the first slide, please? Right. Viking Age Iceland is one of those subjects which, until as little as maybe 10 years ago, everybody thought they knew everything about. We thought that, that there was really nothing new to be said about the Viking settlement of Iceland. And that's begun to change because of new discoveries from archaeology, from scientific techniques which allow us to examine the makeup of people's bones to find out where they were born and whether they travelled in their lives, and most importantly also from genetics, which also tells an awful lot about the origins of populations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with what I'm going to call the traditional history. This is the established history as it has been told for the last 1,000 years, more or less. And it's based on 2 books, both of which are very important to historians. One of them is the Icelandinga book, the Book of the Icelanders, and this was written around about 1120 by somebody called Ari the priest. And this is the earliest history of the Icelandic settlement. So it records traditions about the settlements and about the Christianization of Iceland. The other book is the Landnama book, or the Book of the Settlements. And this was written around about the same time as the Book of the Icelanders, but this didn't have a single author. It's probably a collaborative work. And this book is about basically the first settlers of Iceland. So it contains the names of 3,500 of the first settlers. Most of them are men who are recorded in it, and these were the leaders of the settlements. And it also gives the origins of the settlers, and most of them actually came from Western Norway. And it also gives the names of 1,500 farms and land claims which these original settlers made back in the original settlement period. So this, in a way, for Icelanders is a bit like the Domesday Book for the English. It's the reference that historians, and not just historians, but also people would go to it to find out, to settle land claims. People could say, you know, this land is my land because these people were my ancestors, and it says so in this book. So between these 2, they give a very full picture of the early Icelandic settlements. So if I could move on to the next slide, please. Now, this map's showing the early exploration of Iceland as it's recorded in the Book of the Icelanders. And according to the Book of the Icelanders, the first Viking to discover Iceland was a guy called Nadod, and he is the green line on the right-hand side of the screen, just bobbing into the eastern coast of Iceland. Sometime around about AD 860, he is supposed to have been blown off course on a voyage to the Faroe Islands, and he wound up on the east coast of Iceland. He climbed up a mountain, had a look around, couldn't see anything, no inhabitants, no sign that there's anybody there, and he didn't hang around. He basically sailed off and told people about this island that he discovered, and because it was snowing when he was there, he decided to call it Snowland. Now, around about the same time, we don't know exactly when, another voyager, a guy called Gardar the Swede, also accidentally finished up at Iceland. In this case, he was sailing to the Western Islands of Scotland, and he got blown off course and finished up also on the east coast of Iceland. And he is the purple line on the map. Now, Gardar had a greater sense of curiosity than Nadod, and having discovered an unknown land, he decided he was going to dedicate a bit of time to exploring it. So he set off and he completed the first known circumnavigation of Iceland. And indeed, he actually spent a winter in Iceland at the far north there, at the place called Húsavík, which you can see just right at the top of the map. Now, when he was leaving Húsavík, there was a sort of boating accident, and one of his followers, one of his crew called Nat Farry, and a female slave and a male slave got separated from the group, and they were abandoned. They were marooned on Iceland, and they had to sort of make do for themselves and see whether they could survive. Now, when the main settlement period started, maybe another 10, 14 years later, when people came back to Iceland, they found that Nat Farry and the two slaves were still alive. But if you read the traditional chronicles, nobody says, and so Nat Farry became the first settler in Iceland. He doesn't count as the first settler because he wasn't an important enough person to be able to claim land for himself. So he and the two slaves are mentioned just in passing, but they don't count as the first settlers of Iceland in the official, if you like, the official traditions. Now, Gardar, he of course also found his way back home after this particular voyage, and as well as having a good sense of curiosity, he also had a bit of an ego. He was not a modest man, and he said, "I've discovered this big island, and it's called Gardar's Home, Gardar's Island." That name hasn't stuck any more than Snowland has. Now, following on from Gardar's voyage, that a Norwegian called Floki Vilgedarson heard the reports about Gardar's Island and thought it sounded like it would be quite a good place to settle. So he set off with his followers and landed somewhere up in a place called Vatnsfjord, up in the northwest of Iceland. On the map, his voyages are the ones that are shown with the yellow line. Now, he spent the summer exploring, found that there were lots of seabird colonies, rich with eggs. The land was really very interesting. The one thing he didn't do was actually do much by way of preparing for winter. He'd brought cattle with him and other livestock, but the one thing he needed to do for the winter was to collect some hay for them to feed them through the winter. He didn't get around to doing any of this because he was too busy doing other things, and so come the winter, all of his livestock died, and that meant that his attempt at settlement was going to be a failure. He could not continue with his settlement effort, and he decided that he was going to go home. He set out, but this was it had been a very cold winter. Sea ice in those days came a lot further south than it does today, and he got about as far as the big bay near Reykjavik, and found that he just couldn't go any further. The route home was blocked by ice, so he had to stay a second winter, and finally the following spring he was able to escape. And when he got back to Norway, he didn't have a good word to say about the island that he'd been to. He said that it was completely uninhabitable, and he gave it the name of Iceland because there was so much ice there. And this name is the one that has stuck. Now, Floki wasn't the only person that anyone listened to about this one. There were other people who had been with him who was telling the true story and said, well, you know, if he'd actually sort of been a bit more clued up, things might have gone quite differently. And one of these men who had actually thought that this was a good place to settle, a guy called Thorolf. And he earned himself the nickname Thorolf Butter, because he would say to people, and anyone who would listen to him, he said, it's so rich, the pastures are so rich, there is butter dripping off every blade of grass. So reports from people like Thorolf established quite a lot of interest in the west coast districts of Norway, and it wasn't long before a couple of brothers called Ingolf and Horleif decided to set out and make their own attempt at a settlement. So could I have the next slide, please? And this is a rather romantic 19th century image of Ingolf founding his first settlement. The big post which is being erected there is one of the posts from his high seat, which as a chieftain he would sit on in his great hall. Now, can I have the next slide, please? Now, here on this map, first of all, Ingolf and Horleif, they made a reconnaissance trip and decided, yes, this was a good place to settle. Ingolf was a bit better off than his brother Horleif. Horleif went off on a Viking raid to go and get some loot and capture some slaves to help him set up. And then the two set off. And the traditions say that this happened in 874, AD 874. That they actually set out for their voyage, which would begin the permanent settlement of Iceland. So this voyage is the one which is the sort of tan colour on the map. Now, the two brothers had quite different attitudes according to the traditions. Horleif was an impatient man. He got to Iceland and he said, well, I'm just going to settle here. I like this place. You can see where it is at the end of the blue arrow. And he landed there and set up his first settlement. In the course of the winter, he worked his slaves too hard. They weren't very happy with it, and they murdered him. And then the slaves fled to some offshore islands, and you can see the dotted purple line lead to them. They are the islands which are called the Vestmannaeyjar. The slaves were Irishmen, and Vestmannaeyjar means in Icelandic the islands of the Irish. They took refuge there, and of course Ingolf, meanwhile, was quite unaware of what was going on. Now, this is a bit of a pagan morality story, because rather than just sort of settle anywhere, Ingolf had said that when I get to Iceland, I will throw the high seat, the pillars from my high seat over the side of the ship, and I will settle only where the gods cast them ashore. So he spent 2 years following the coast of Iceland, and he eventually found his pillars washed up at a place which he called the Bay of Smokes, Reykjavik, which is now the capital of Iceland. And of course his settlement was a successful settlement. And as you can see, the success goes to the ones who respect the gods, and those who don't respect the gods get murdered. Now, from where Ingolf is supposed to have cast his high seat pillars into the sea, there is really not a chance that they would have been washed up anywhere near Reykjavik, because of the prevailing currents go really from the southwest to the northwest. So this story about the high seat pillars is a fable. But in the immediate aftermath of his settlement, once he was established, Ingolf set out to go and find out how his brother was getting on. He got there, found that he'd been killed, and then hunted down the Irishmen on the Vestmannaeyjar and killed them. But this was the beginning of the settlements, and after them, things hotted up, and more people started to arrive in Iceland. So can I have the next slide, please? So the what they call the settlement period, the landnam period, really extended from about 874 up to around about 930, by which time all of the best land had been claimed. We can estimate from the number of settlers who are listed in the Landnama book that the first wave of settlement probably included around about 20,000 people or so, because every leading settler would have brought with him, there would have been his family, followers and slaves. So for the last 30 years or so of the 9th century, there were probably something like about 1,000 people a year turning up in Iceland. Which I obviously should have said was of course there were no locals there to get in the way. It was an uninhabited island. Now, the traditions explain the motives of these settlers in terms of them being, in a sense, political refugees. That most of the leading settlers were minor chieftains in Norway. And this was a time in Scandinavia when the three kingdoms, Denmark, Norway and Sweden, were being formed. And kings were beginning to get more and more powerful as they managed to take more power to themselves and cut down on the freedom of small chieftains. And the Norwegian traditions have it that that Norway was first united by a king called Harald Fairhair, and it was Harald Fairhair's tyrannical rule, imposing taxes and interfering with the chiefs in all sorts of ways, that drove the early settlers to leave Norway and flee out to Iceland, where they would be able to set up in complete independence and freedom without the rule of kings, and they would be able to carry on with their traditional lifestyles out there in Iceland. Now, the problem with this story is that we don't really know exactly when Harald Fairhair lived, because in Norway at the time it was still a pre-literate society. It's possible that Harald was not even born in 874 when Ingolf made his first settlement, and he may not have come to the throne until maybe as late as about 895. So the story about Harald himself is one that can't be literally true, but because it is a period of state formation where we do know that there was a lot of strife in Scandinavia as kings were competing with one another for more and more power, that those kind of circumstances were probably prevailing in Norway, whether or not it was directly Harald Fairhair himself who drove them all to go overseas. And this tradition is important because it ties in with the traditional view of the Icelanders. They liked in their histories to present themselves as basically a kind of aristocratic people, and to also to be freedom-loving and independent people, independent-minded people, and particularly this idea of being independent people. It has been very internalized into the Icelandic character, I think. So this is this freedom-loving aspect of it is very, very important to the future development of Icelandic national character. But I think that the question is, do these traditions really tell us the full story about the colonization of Iceland? And recent discoveries suggest that it doesn't actually tell us the full story. So could I have the next slide, please? Now, initially, with the development of modern archaeological techniques, archaeological discoveries served, in fact, only to shore up the traditional account. Iceland, as I'm sure you're all well aware, is a volcanic island. It has frequent volcanic eruptions, and the bigger eruptions can spread layers of volcanic ash right across the whole island. This is here is the eruption, a 2014 eruption of a volcano called Bardarbunga. This is a very active volcano, and when it does erupt, it tends to be quite violent eruptions, and we know that Bardarbunga erupted in 871 or thereabouts, and spread this cloud of ash right across the whole of Iceland. In fact, it also reached Greenland and Britain. This was a big eruption. And what these various, if I could have the next slide, please. Right, so if you were digging a section of the trench in Iceland and you're looking at the stratigraphy, you can see in the soil the layers that are left over by these ash falls. The ash is called tephra, and they can be very exactly dated, partly by the radiometric dating methods, and also by recovering samples out of ice cores from glaciers, where you can sort of count the years exactly through each winter's layer of snow. So there was this eruption dated to 871 plus or minus 2 years, and they call this one the settlement layer, because for years and years and years, when archaeologists excavated old settlements in Iceland, they never found any trace of human activity in Iceland below this level. All traces were always above that level. So this fitted in very, very well with the traditional account of a settlement in 874. That it fitted well almost exactly with Ingólf's sort of date of arriving in that year. So we just gather my thoughts from, sorry about that, but that position has started in recent years with more archaeological excavations to change a little bit. And if I could have the next slide, please. So the first evidence that there might have been people in Iceland before 874 is in the basement of this hotel in Reykjavik. This hotel was built on the site of a derelict building in 2001, and before it was built, they did an archaeological investigation at the site, and they discovered down below there a farmstead, a longhouse, and evidence of walls, and the walls of this farmstead were coated in ash from the 871 eruption. So this proved that there were people actually living in Reykjavik, setting up a farm shortly before 871, a little bit earlier than the traditional date. It wasn't in itself a very big challenge because it's still only a matter of a few years one way or another. If you're actually visiting in Reykjavik, what they did was, with the remains of this farm, it was so important. It may actually be Ingólf's farm because it's so early in its dating. But those remains are now preserved in the basement of the hotel, and you can visit them if you're on holiday in Reykjavik anytime. Now, can I have the next slide, please? Now, since 2001, there have been two further discoveries of archaeological sites which predate the Bardarbunga eruption, and these predate it by a lot more than just a few years. Now, in the traditional accounts, they record that there were Irish monks living in Iceland before the Vikings arrived there. This is pretty likely, I think, to be true. Irish monks were great seafarers. They certainly got to the Faroe Islands, and they were also going to an island which they called Thule in the 8th century, and that's pretty certainly going to be Iceland. The early settlers also they said that they had found croziers and books and other things which the Irish had left behind when they fled when the Vikings turned up. As with the Vikings, there was going to be no more peace and quiet in Iceland for them to pray and meditate in peace. And there are two places on the southeast coast of Iceland, Papos and Papey, which are both named after Irish monks. The Viking name for an Irish monk was Papa. So these two places are likely to be places where the early settlers actually did encounter Irishmen. There isn't actually, though, however, any hard archaeological evidence of the Irish presence there. And we can be quite sure that the two sites, Voga and Stoth, which are on this map, were not Irish. If I can have the next slide, please. Okay, now this is the site at Stoth in the eastern fjords of Iceland. And you can see that this is, from the outline there, is the outlines of two longhouses. There's a smaller one in the middle and a larger one on the outside. This is definitely a Viking building. It's not something which the Irish would have built, because the Irish monks, they tended to build round houses as dwelling houses, not oblong houses. The site at Voga on the Reykjanes Peninsula, that also is a longhouse. So that too is definitely a Norse building. The interesting thing about both of them is that they very clearly were there a long time before the Bardarbunga eruption. In the case of Stoth, you can see that the smaller longhouse in the centre there, that actually dates to the settlement period. That was built by the early settlers who arrived in the Landnam period. But the larger longhouse, and it is a very large longhouse even by sort of Norwegian standards, may have been built as much as 60 years before the traditional date of the settlement. So we're talking not long after AD 800. So that's a long time before the official settlement. What's also very interesting about both the settlement at Stoth and at Voga is that neither of them have got any evidence at all that they were farming settlements. There's no agriculture going on there, no livestock. So we have to ask is, well, what were they? What were they there for? The most likely explanation of this is that they were hunters' bases. In the early Middle Ages, there were plenty of seals around Iceland, and there were also walrus. And walrus in the Middle Ages were an important source of ivory from their tusks. So a good market for walrus ivory in Europe. Walrus hides were much in demand. They made the best ropes for ships because they were very waterproof. And sealskins were pretty much the medieval equivalent of Gore-Tex. If you wanted a waterproof boots or a waterproof coat, you would have sealskin if you could. So it looks like from these sites that the basic story that's preserved in the Book of the Icelanders about the discovery of Iceland is not basically true. There were people from Scandinavia, probably from Norway, visiting Iceland a long time before Nadod and Gardar and Floki ever set foot in Iceland. And it begs the question, why has their story not been recorded in that? Because it can't really be the case that the early settlers were unaware that there had been Vikings living in Iceland or visiting Iceland before they arrived, and particularly here at Stowth. After all, they built a longhouse in the middle of the ruins of the old longhouse, and they couldn't have failed to have noticed that it was there. So they missed out of their traditional history a complete chapter of Icelandic history and exploration. I think that this is maybe because it didn't really fit with the image of the free aristocratic people that they were trying to project in those histories. What they were really doing here was they thought, well, these were just grubby merchants, people who were going out there just to make money, and that wasn't really what they wanted to think it had all been about. They were really the freedom-loving people who were escaping from tyranny, rather than profit-seeking merchants. So I think that is perhaps what's going on there. Anyway, this is very early days because these two sites have only been discovered in about the last 7 or 8 years, and they're only now just being published. So this is very, very new and up to date material. So could I have the next slide, please? Right. Okay. Now, another source of new information that we're getting, as I say, was from genetics and from the new techniques which we can use for studying skeletal remains. And here I've got two pictures. One of them is a reconstruction of the burial of a young woman. She was probably maybe in her late 20s. She's been called the Lady in Blue because parts of her dress were preserved in the grave and it was dyed blue. She probably died around about 915 or 925. Her skeleton wasn't in terribly good condition, but her teeth were still preserved, and you can learn quite a lot about a person's origins from their teeth, because they preserve minerals from the place where you were brought up, and they last there in your adult teeth. They stay there all the way through your life, whereas the minerals in your bones change quite regularly because the calcium is replaced. So the teeth provide a record of your early life. Now, this woman was given a respectable burial. She had with her the basic grave goods that you would expect a respectable, not a rich woman, but a respectable Viking woman would have been given. They include, you can see at the top of the photograph of the reconstruction of the dress, 2 oval brooches. They were very, very traditional items for Viking women. They're basically fastenings to hold the dress up. She had a necklace of amber and other glass beads, and items for spinning and weaving, which were symbols of her household authority. So she had a respectable burial. Now, what was discovered from analysis of her teeth was that she was an immigrant. She wasn't born in Iceland. She was brought up somewhere else, most likely in northern or western Britain. So from that point of view, she wasn't even probably even a Scandinavian. We also know from analysis that she had a change of diet sometime between the ages of 5 and 10. She was brought up on a terrestrial diet of grain and meat, and from between 5 and 10, she was changed to a diet which included more seafood, less meat, seaweed even, and there was less of it. She wasn't particularly well fed as she became a teenager. But obviously she married. She may well, given her age, have died in childbirth, which was quite a serious risk for women in the Viking Age. And she was given a respectable burial. So the likelihood is, I think, that this girl was say brought up somewhere in Britain. She was captured by Viking slave raiders as a child, taken to Iceland, not particularly well treated in her young years, but as she grew up, she looked like a pretty girl, and some Viking man thought that she would make a good wife, and in the marriage she was valued and respected partner, and given the kind of send-off that any respectable free woman would have been given. So this is the kind of really detailed, intimate, personal information that we can start to learn simply by looking at examining a tooth. So I think in the years to come, we're going to discover a lot more about the origins of early Icelanders in that particular way. Also, of course, the other big revelation has been from genetics, from the analysis of the DNA of modern Icelanders. And what has been discovered is that as far as male Icelanders are concerned, most of them, something like 75% of them, have Y chromosomes, which mark them as having descended from the people of Norway, or originating in Norway. Y chromosomes are only passed down from father to son, and they give you the direct line of descent. So the majority of Icelandic men are indeed of Scandinavian ancestry. About 25% of them, though, have genes which link them to Britain and Ireland, and they were therefore probably slaves. Now, the women, however, this is a lot more interesting. Only 35% of women can be traced to have Scandinavian origins, and the direct maternal lines for women, they're traced through the mitochondrial DNA, which can only be passed down through the mother. And I say only 35% of women have mitochondrial DNA, which originated in Scandinavia, and the other 65% are all traceable back again to Britain and Ireland. So it looks like almost half of the early settlers of Iceland were slaves from Britain and Ireland rather than Scandinavians. And of course, the fact is that there were far more female slaves taken over than male slaves taken over. And that tells us also something important about the settlers. That they like to present themselves in their traditions as these aristocratic types of noble origin. But clearly, an awful lot of the men who settled in Iceland were basically free men who were so poor that no respectable Scandinavian woman would dream of marrying them. And the only way they were going to get a wife was to sort of go and get a slave, marry a slave girl. So again, it shows that the origins of an awful lot of the Icelanders the men were probably landless, quite poor, landless men who went to Iceland not as refugees, but because it was probably the only way they were ever going to get a farm of their own, was to emigrate, and the only way they would get a wife was to marry a slave girl. So I think that shows casts quite a different light on the settlement from the story which is told in the traditional sources. So if we can have the next slide, please. Now I'm just going to talk a bit about the actual process of settlement. Now we shouldn't imagine that Vikings went to Iceland in long ships. They weren't really the right kind of ships for crossing the Atlantic. They weren't really the right ships for settlement. And so the ships which they used were called knars. They were fairly broad, tubby trading ships with a hold. They could carry around about 40 or 50 tons of cargo. And one of these ships would have been suitable for a sort of extended family group to take their supplies and livestock and everything over to Iceland for settlement. So these are the kind of ships they'd be turning up in, something a bit less glamorous. And you also think about the onward voyages, Eric the Red to Greenland and Leif Erikson to Vinland. Those are further onward voyages would also have been made in ships like this rather than in long ships. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, the country that they found was looked quite a lot different than Iceland does nowadays. Today, only about 25% of Iceland has got vegetation cover. In the time of the Viking settlements in the 870s, about 40% of Iceland had vegetation cover, and about 25% of Iceland had birch woodland on it. And nowadays it's only 1%. There's been an awful lot of overgrazing and felling, but the Iceland that settlers arrived in was a much greener place than the Iceland that you see nowadays when you go and visit there. So it was not nearly as austere. The way that the settlers made claims was that the leading settler, the chief, basically claimed a river valley, and this made defining the boundaries of a land claim quite easy, because you basically did it from the one watershed to the other. So the mountain ridges around the edges of the valley would form a fairly clear and indisputable boundary to the land claim. Now, can I have the next slide? Next slide, please. Now, this is a photograph of traditional haymaking, actually in the Faroe Islands, but the landscape's very similar. And I think to us, Iceland looks a rather bleak place and not terribly attractive for farming. But most of the settlers came from the west coast areas of Norway, where it was primarily pastoral farming. Sheep, cattle, goats were the basis of the farming economy. And the most important thing was grass. And where the grass would grow in the summer, you could get enough grass together to keep the cattle through the winter. And both Faroe Islands and Iceland have got quite mild climates, quite mild winters, mild summers for the latitude, considering that Iceland is almost on the Arctic Circle. So these islands would have looked quite attractive to pastoral farmers. And say the main crop wasn't grain or root vegetables or anything like that. The main crop that everyone concentrated on was grass. I think these particular farmers here in the Faroe Islands weren't relying over heavily on the hay in their hay fields, because after they'd stacked all the hay up to dry, they got their gear together and they took it up and threw them into the back of a top of the range BMW and drove off. So I think they were probably making most of their money somewhere else. But it gives an idea of what the traditional methods that were used. You had to dry the hay to keep it through the winter. So can I have the next slide, please? This is a reconstruction of of an early settlement period farm, a place called Stong, and it's known really as the Icelandic Pompeii because it was buried in 1104 during a major eruption of Mount Hekla, one of Iceland's most famous volcanoes, and so very well preserved. The building technique it's very typical of Icelandic architecture. Houses would have stone foundations, they would be quite durable, but the bulk of the walls would be built of laying turfs on top of one another, and then there would be a roof, but that also would be turfed over. These houses would have been very well insulated, very dark because they didn't have windows, but they'd have kept you quite warm in the winter. And this building technique really didn't change very much at all until the 20th century, when they started building more in materials like concrete and wood. But once established, this was pretty much how Icelanders lived for the next 800 years, really, not just in the Viking period. So next slide, please. Vikings, when they arrived in Iceland, of course, an uninhabited land, there was no government there to police that society, to settle land claims or anything of that nature. Wherever Vikings went, they tended to pretty quickly set up the one institution of government which they had, and that was the Thing. The Thing is just basically a gathering at which all free men were entitled to speak, and they were usually held annually, and they were an arena for people to settle disputes. Excuse me, I'm just going to. I'm just getting a bit dry. And almost everywhere in Iceland, soon after the settlement period, local things were set up to deal with local disputes. But there was a big problem of disputes between some of the bigger chieftains who had claimed greater land claims for themselves. And disputes over land often became bloody. People got killed, and that resulted in blood feuds, which could go on from generation to generation. Any of you who have read any of the Icelandic family sagas will know that the blood feud is a central theme to a lot of them, and the working out of a blood feud through the generations as vengeance is sought by both sides, tit for tat, never-endingly, in fact. So it was decided around about 927 that Iceland needed to have some kind of central court where disputes could be settled in a way that would try to sort of make the colony less violent. So the leading chieftains agreed amongst themselves that they would send a man called Ulfjotur off to Norway, and he would travel around Norway, and he would study all of the law codes from the different things in Norway, and then come back to Iceland and formulate a law code for Iceland. Studying law this way in those days was quite an achievement because, of course, this was not a literate society. They didn't have any written records. So Ulfjotur had to go off to Norway, and he had to remember everything, commit everything to his learned to memory, and then on his return, he had then to sort it all out into a coherent law code. Now, whilst Ulfjotur was away in Norway learning about law, his half-brother, Grimmer Goatbeard, was travelling around Iceland to find a suitable place to have an all Iceland thing, which became called the Althing. And the place he chose was here at Thingvellir, the Thing plain. can I have the next slide, please? Which you see that's the big red star on the map there, not too far from Reykjavik, and it's a very popular day trip out from Reykjavik. Part of what they call in tourist circles the Golden Circle, and they also will take you to the Geysir and to Gullfoss waterfall. So if you're in Reykjavik for only one day and you want a trip out into the Icelandic countryside, it's the best trip you can do if you've just got one day in Iceland. Now, would you mind going back to the previous slide again? Thank you very much. Grimmer chose this place because firstly, you can see that it's a rather sheltered ravine. Iceland's weather is not dependable at any time of the year, even in the summer when the Althing, as it was called, was held. So here's a location that provided good shelter from the elements. It is, although of course he didn't know it and nobody else did for a long time afterwards, but this rifting is actually part of the mid-Atlantic rift. And this is the part in the Atlantic where North America and Europe are being sort of torn apart by tectonic movements, being stretched apart. And this is just on the American side of the rift. And the rift is still widening. And I first visited Thingvellir, I think about 40 years ago when I was a student. And in that time, there are chasms and cracks there which have been opening up and getting gradually wider and wider as a result of the earth movements there. So this is a place of change, geologically significant as well as culturally significant. Now, if I could just go on, sorry, to the next slide again, please. So Iceland's most densely populated area was here on the map in what's called the southern quarter. But Thingvellir was also in a good position to be reached from the other regions in Iceland, and nobody needed to travel more than 10 days to get there. So it was a good site. It was functional from the point of view of having meetings, and it was also reasonably convenient for people to get to. So could I go on to the next slide, please? Now, this is a painting by an English artist, W.G. Collingwood, who travelled a lot in Iceland, and it's an imaginative reconstruction of what the Althing might have looked like in Viking times. Its main function was to settle legal disputes and make new laws. There was only one institution at the Althing, and that was the institution of the law speaker. Ulfjotter was the first law speaker. They were elected, and they served for 3 years. And on each year, they were expected to stand there on the law rock in the middle, and they would proclaim and recite 1/3 of the Icelandic law code. They were always accompanied by other legal experts who, if they had a lapse of memory, could help them out. But the law speaker was the only governmental institution in Iceland. This was, as well though as being an important legal occasion, it was a great social occasion because it brought people together from across Iceland. It was a place where merchants would turn up, there would be trade, marriages would be arranged. For the more important people, they would bring along they had their own permanent sites where they would put up their tents every year, and you can still see, if you visit the place, you can still see the foundations of some of these temporary shelters which people would build there. And it was a great social occasion, as well as being a legal occasion. Now, Icelanders are quite fond of saying that theirs is the oldest democracy in the world, but it's not really true. Because although all free men had the right to speak the Althing, only 37 people had the right to vote, and they were the great chieftains called the Gothi. So they alone got to vote in the Althing. They had their followers with them, so obviously nobody was tied permanently to a lord, to a chief. If someone was dissatisfied with his chief, he could always defect to another chief. So there was a lot of consensus in decision making, but when it actually came to a vote, it was the big guys who actually decided what happened. So next slide, please. This is the first written law code. So all the laws had to be memorized. This was written around about 1260. It's called the Grey Goose law code. Nobody's at all sure why, but this is, say, the oldest oldest actually written law code in Iceland. So next slide, please. The most important achievement of the Althing was the peaceful conversion of Iceland to Christianity. This was something which threatened to throw Iceland into a civil war, disputes between Christians and pagans, and it also threatened the intervention of the Norwegian king, Olav Tryggvason, who was a militant Christianizer. And the Icelanders, although they couldn't make them decide between themselves whether they were going to be Christian or pagan, the one thing they could agree on was that they didn't want to come under the Norwegian king. So the law speaker of the time, Thorgeir, he took upon himself the task of deciding. All the chiefs agreed, and they would agree that his decision would be binding. Although he was a pagan, he decided that it was best for Iceland to become Christian because this would preserve its independence. And once made, the decision stuck. Everybody abided by it. Thorgeir did he showed his goodwill by, when he got home, he threw all of his pagan idols into this waterfall, which is now called Goðafoss, the fall of the gods as a result of it. Now, moving on just very quickly to the post-Viking period. The Christianity spread pretty quickly in Iceland. It was a very thoroughly Christianized society, probably within about 50 or 60 years. First bishopric was founded in 1056 at Skalholt in the south of Iceland, and it became, I suppose, really a normal part of Christian Europe by around about the year 1100. So can I move on? Next slide, please. But things went downhill for the Icelanders really after that. There was a lot of overgrazing and deforestation. Soil erosion set in. This is an ash desert in the north of Iceland. The soils are fragile, weather bad, and there was vast amount of soil erosion. The climate began to deteriorate into what's called a little ice age. So famines became common, and there was a great deal of periods of malnutrition. Next slide, please. Another problem for the Icelanders was, of course, there was no timber in Iceland that you could build ships with. So once the ships that the settlers came in had decayed, they couldn't build any more. And that meant that trade fell into the hands of foreigners, particularly Norwegians, Germans, and the English. Iceland actually had a valuable product in dried cod, which was in demand in medieval Europe, but it was the foreigners who transported it all to market, and they were the ones who got most of the profits. So Iceland became a very poor country, and it remained very poor until it became independent in the 20th century. So if I can have the next slide, please. And it also lost its independence in 1262. Feuding between the Gothi threatened to plunge Iceland into civil war, and they accepted the rule of Håkon IV in 1262 in order to maintain the peace. And until it passed in 1398 to Danish rule, and it became fully independent only in 1944. And that time really marked the beginning of modern Iceland and gave them the chance to take control of their own economy. Now, if I could just move on, next one, please. So I'm just going to say very briefly now, just a couple of minutes about the legacy of medieval Iceland, and that will to finish off with. Two things on this. Firstly, in the Viking period, Vikings settled very widely in Europe, in England, Scotland, Ireland, France, and Russia. But in all of these places, the Viking settlers were very quickly assimilated by the locals and lost their identity. So Iceland with the Faroe Islands is important because it is the only permanent extension of the Scandinavian world that actually resulted from the Viking Age. But I think for the rest of the world, it's probably its imaginative literary legacy which is most important. This is an imaginative drawing of Snorri Sturluson, who was probably medieval Iceland's most important figure. He was a law speaker, a powerful chieftain in his own right, but he was a prolific writer and historian, and he wrote probably also some of the family sagas, which many people consider to be among the greatest literature in the world. Snorri, though, is most important probably, I think, for, if you bring on the next slide, please. This work, which is called the Edda, and there is also a poetic version with an anonymous author. And one of the things about the Icelanders is they were the only people really in pagan Northern Europe who actually bothered to record the stories of their pagan gods. And without the Icelanders, without that, we would know next to nothing about the Viking gods and the Viking religion. With just as little as we know about the Anglo-Saxon gods, for example, because the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Swedes didn't record their traditions any more than the Germans or Anglo-Saxons did. So if I could have the next slide, please. This, for example, it's a picture from this manuscript showing Odin, the one-eyed god, king of the gods. Just one of the stories that is preserved about him. If we can have the next slide. So not only do the Icelandic sagas record the stories of the gods, but they also record the stories of the creation of the universe in a sort of gap between ice and fire. And they also go on to record the story of the end of the universe, Ragnarok, in which the world will be destroyed by fire. And without the Icelanders, we would have absolutely no idea of anything about these stories whatsoever, as neither the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Danes did not go to any great trouble to record their pagan myths. In fact, in most parts of Northern Europe, when people converted to Christianity, they were ashamed of their pagan past and actually did their best to cover it up. Only the Icelanders had some pride in their past and recorded it. And if we go to the next slide, please. So I think that we have a great imaginative debt to the medieval Icelanders, because without their literature, we wouldn't just have the great pleasure of their stories, but we would have lost the inspiration for countless works of art and literature in the modern world. Without the Icelandic traditions, there would probably be no Tolkien as we know it. There would be no Wagner's Ring Cycle. There probably wouldn't even be Marvel comics as we know them. And as I say, many other artists and writers in the Western tradition have drawn inspiration from them. So we owe them quite a cultural debt. So I'm going to end here, and thank you for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed the talk, and I believe now that Claire is going to give me some of the questions which you've submitted during the talk.
Yes, hi John. First question comes in from Peter in the United States, and his question is, can many modern day Icelanders trace their origins back to the Vikings?
Well, I would say that as long as we discount very recent immigrants, yes, probably almost all of them can, in fact, trace back their ancestry to people who are named in the Landnama book as the original settlers, and in some cases to people even beyond that, where we know something about the ancestry of the first settlers. The Icelanders were very keen on recording their genealogies because land claims depended on them so much. And of course, they're also a small insular community. So there's been a great deal of intermarriage between people over the centuries. So everybody is related to everybody else to some degree, and so much so that you can actually get an app for your mobile phone. So that if you're starting to date with someone and you're getting a bit serious with them, you can make sure that you're not actually too closely related to get married. So yes, they're very proud of their genealogical knowledge, and most of them will be able to trace their ancestry all the way back.
Thank you. The next question comes in from Deborah in Washington in the United States, and her question is there any evidence of permanent settlers from Floki's expeditions?
I don't think anyone has actually found the sites of his settlement. It may be Floki actually relented of his bad opinion, and he actually did go back to Iceland, but he settled in the north of Iceland and not in the areas where he had initially tried to settle. I wouldn't expect it was likely that we would find hard evidence of his temporary settlements. When the Icelanders in the settlement period arrived, they basically just threw up fairly rough huts of turf to begin with, and they concentrated actually on establishing the farm rather than on building themselves a nice place to live. And only really when the farm was up and running and they were economically secure did they actually then sort of rebuild in more durable materials. So I would think in the two places where Floki, at least assuming that the story is true, because it may be part of a foundation myth, but if he was only there for a season, he would just have thrown up a fairly rough turf hut that now is maybe just an undistinguished lump in the ground with nothing much to identify it. So I think probably unlikely that any hard evidence would be found of it.
Thank you. Next question comes in from Al in the United States, and his question is, did the Vikings wear horned caps? And if so, how and why did, if so, why and how did that originate?
They didn't have horned helmets. I always think it's a shame that they didn't, because they look so much more wildly barbarian, romantically barbarian than the helmets that they really wore. But no, they didn't have horns on the helmets because even if that they would have caught sword blows. The idea, if someone hits you over the head with a sword or an axe, you want the blow to glance off. And if you'd had horns on your helmet, they would have caught the blow and made it much more forceful. So no, they didn't have them. The belief that they had horned helmets is quite a recent one, because when you look at iconographical evidence from the Viking Age, both the stuff which Vikings themselves drew and which medieval Europeans who were their victims drew, they're never shown with horned helmets. And I think it comes from two things. Early antiquarians in Scandinavia, excuse me, dug up various bronze horned helmets, which were ritual helmets from which were ritual helmets from the Bronze Age. And because they didn't have much of a sense of deep time in the early 19th century, they thought, well, maybe these were Viking helmets. But the bit where it really stuck was really that Wagner, for his operas, gave all his Valkyries horned helmets. And it's really Wagner who popularised the idea that the Vikings ran around in horned helmets.
Thank you. Quite a lengthy question. It's coming from Alan in the United States, and he says, could you please describe the booths set up at a meeting of the Althing? Where were they located with respect to the Law Rock? Were they in proximity to one another? And finally, how many people temporarily stayed in the booths?
Right. Well, I can't really give you a clear answer about how many people would have stayed in the booths, because we don't really have any statistics from that period. The booths were not huge. You can still see in the ground the humps, because they built for themselves. They built permanent foundations on which they would then erect the booths, for the Althing, and then take like a sort of tent or something, and then they would take it down after the Althing and take it home with them. So you can see them there. They were not big. They don't look like they've been quite crowded even with a full family in them, I think. I can't imagine there were an awful lot of people living in the booths. They're the ones we know about, you can see they are actually all nestled down in the ravine, and many of them are very close to the Law Rock. In fact, actually within a few yards of the Law Rock. So there may have been others scattered about, but probably you needed to be someone who was very important to be able to get your booth that close to the Law Rock. But yes, if you visit Thingvellir, you'll be able to see. You'll be able to see these booths where they are, and I say they were quite small.
We just had a lovely comment come in actually from Kathleen in the United States, and she wanted to say to you, Professor Haywood, that your presentation was much appreciated and it was fascinating. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Nice.
Thank you. I'm pleased about that. It's the first time I've done this, so thank you very much.
We've had a question come in from Harry, and he would like to ask if you could please comment about the unique volcanic glass that the Vikings used that allow them to see the sun through overcast skies. He says the glass comes from Iceland.
Right. I'm going to be maybe a bit of a disappointment on this one, because I'm not sure that I really believe in this. There is, I think he's talking about what is called the sunstone, which is believed to be a mineral called calcite, Iceland spar, which has polarizing capabilities, and you can, using a crystal, sort of point it up at the sun, and because the light is polarized, if you hold it at a particular angle to the sun, it shows you the direction of the sun. I actually do have a sunstone and have tested it, and it works very fine on a clear day when you can see the sun anyway. When it's a light overcast, which you can see the sun through, it still works. But on a very heavily overcast day, I can't see that it works. And scientific evidence, and there's been quite a lot of research into this, and most of the scientific evidence suggests that the sunstone does not work under an overcast sky, so it would actually be a bit useless. the sunstone actually only appears in two Norse short stories, and it's not in those stories. It isn't used at sea, and it's not being used for navigation. It is actually used for telling the time. But we've never found a sunstone in a Viking navigational context, and I personally don't believe that they used it.
Thank you. We've had a question in from Carol, and she says, how do you know the Irish and some English were slaves and not people who migrated and lived in Iceland?
Right. On this one, of course, we don't have their testimony because they're dead, of course. And the reason why we think that the non-Scandinavians were slaves is, firstly, that the sagas and the traditions in the Landnama book do not refer or name any non-Scandinavians as settlers. So they were certainly not if there were voluntary emigrants, they were certainly not among the leading settlers who actually claimed any land. And it is also very clear in the sagas that particularly when slaves appear, they're usually they're Irish, and there's no mention of free people from anywhere other than Scandinavia. So there's no literary evidence for free settlers from any other part of the world than Scandinavia. I should also say that on this, slaving was a major Viking activity. They're particularly active in Ireland, and for over 200 years, basically, they milked Ireland of its surplus population in the same way that European slave traders milked West Africa of its surplus population for the slave trade. So the Vikings were very active slave traders. It was an important economic institution for them, and there isn't really any evidence to suggest that they invited non-Scandinavians along to join them in the settlements.
Thank you. Question from Kristin. She says that she's working on a PhD in Irish myth. And her question is there a myth about Vikings and travellers that would barter their way onto Viking ships, and that Vikings should allow the travellers to do so, because if they refused, bad things might happen on their journey, which the travellers were meant to protect them from?
I've got to plead ignorance on this one. I haven't come across that particular story. I know that there are in Irish sources that there are stories of Irish men, in fact, who were captured and kidnapped by Vikings, telling about their adventures and how they eventually escaped from the Vikings. But I have to be honest on this one. I've not come across this particular myth.
Okay. So John, this is your last question of the evening, and it comes in from Estelle in Lady Lake. She actually says that she's travelling with us in the summer. Could you tell her what the most interesting Viking sites to visit in Iceland are, please?
Right. Well, there aren't really any, I guess, spectacular Viking sites in Iceland, because they didn't really build in very durable materials. If you're visiting, as part of the cruise, then one of the best sites is the settlement exhibition, which I showed a photograph of in the basement underneath that hotel in Reykjavik. Because then, of course, you can get right down very, very close to one of the very first settlements that was founded in Iceland. and it's very well displayed down there in the basement. And they often also have exhibitions there of saga manuscripts and other cultural artifacts like that. So that's definitely well worth a visit. They also do have what they call, I think they call it the Settlement Museum, which is a bit of a catchpenny thing with sort of like a sort of waxworks, sort of showing scenes from the sagas, but that's not genuine. That's all just modern fakery. The National Museum, Iceland's National Historical Museum, also, of course, has got good archaeological collections in it from the settlement period. To see other things, you'd need to go quite a lot further afield. Within reach of Reykjavik, there is that farm that I showed a photograph of at Stong, but you would need to have a four-wheel drive. You probably need a four-wheel drive vehicle to reach it, because it's a bit off the beaten track. And there you would also be able to visit, going in the opposite direction, a place called Snorrastoffa at Reykholt, and that's about an hour and a half's drive out of Reykjavik. And this was the home of Snorri Sturluson, the saga writer, the guy who wrote the Eddas, and who did so much to preserve the the pagan traditions of the Viking world. And that's very good. There's a sort of visitor centre there. You see the remains of his house, including his outdoor hot tub, which he had, which was fed by water from the local hot springs. So those are things which you can reach from Reykjavik. But going further afield, there are other sites. But if you're going to be based in Reykjavik, they're probably the ones which are most easily accessible. So thank you very much. That's it for this. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see maybe some of you on board ship again sometime soon. So good night.